people around Zoom. Yeah.
Welcome everyone. As for postdoc,
Yeah, I think nobody can hear you on Zoom. The mic is here.
This side. Okay.
The mic is
so Anne needs no introduction. She has a background in statistical physics. She has a PhD in statistical physics at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Then she did a postdoc with the Barcelona at Penn / and since 2016 she's been doing extremely interesting work combining theory and data analysis to study adaptable brain function uncertainty.
Thank you so much, Christina. It's really a pleasure to be here and to see you all in person and to have a virtual audience joining us as well. Please interrupt me with questions as we go along. My lab, like many labs, is interested in understanding how animals make sense of their surroundings and how they use this information to guide flexible behavior. And if the brain had unlimited, well, let me step back. We tend to approach this from a normative perspective by asking questions like, what sorts of signals should the brain sense? And what sorts of actions should an animal take in any given scenario? And now, if the brain had unlimited computational resources, we might have somewhat easy answers to these questions. We might be able to say that the brain should just sense everything, and then it should compute what the best action might be at any point in time, and then animals should take that best action. But of course, real brains are limited in what sorts of signals they can sense and how precisely, and real animals are limited in what sorts of actions they can actually execute. And so to overcome these limitations, we think about internal computations that the brain could use to flexibly link this process of sensing what's in the world and deciding what to do with that information. And we think about these internal computations in the context of the environments that animals have to survive and thrive in, with the idea being that these internal computations can exploit statistical regularities in an animal's surroundings to make efficient use of the brain's limited resources. So this is our broad approach to problems. We've been working on a variety of different things in this very big space. And so I want to start by just giving you a sense of the types of questions we've been asking and highlight a few ongoing projects. I won't have time to go into any real detail in any of these, so I'd be happy to talk more about them offline. And then I'll dive into the problem that I want to tell you about today. Okay, so at one sort of extreme, Yipei Guo, who's a postdoc in our lab, has been thinking about how animals sample and gather resources from their surroundings. And she's been thinking about this in the context of foraging, where animals have to dynamically balance their energetic needs with the energetic cost of seeking out resources to meet those needs. And if animals are very hungry and energy is very limited, and if seeking out better energy requires expending energy, then it becomes important to balance these costs and demands accordingly. And so we've been working together with Vivek Jayaraman's lab at Janelia and Carlos Ribeiro's lab at Champalimaud to test some of these ideas in foraging assay for fruit flies. And we've been more recently thinking about another class of foraging problems together with Josh Dudman at Janelia. Now, an animal's ability to, say, navigate away from some patch of food and return back to that same patch relies on internal computations that enable an animal to know where it is relative to its sensory surroundings. This is something that many animals, big and small, need to do in order to survive. This is what allows us to know where we are if we close our eyes and turn around in a room. And we have theoretical frameworks that tell us how we think big brains could implement these types of computations. But these frameworks break down when we think about very small circuits. And so this is something that Marcella Norman, who's another postdoc in the lab, has been thinking a lot about. And she's been interested in understanding how very small circuits can overcome the limitations of their discreteness to perform computations that we thought were possible only in much bigger systems. And so she's specifically been interested in understanding how very small networks can maintain an accurate internal representation of an animal's heading and its surroundings by integrating self-motion information. And she's shown that with the appropriate tuning, even networks with only a handful of neurons can accurately integrate self-motion to keep track of where an animal is. And so we've been building on some of these ideas to then understand how these internal representations are used to guide flexible behavior. And this is something that we've been working on together with Chuntal Dan, the senior scientist in UX. And here we've been thinking about how animals simultaneously map a new sensory environment and infer their goals within that environment, and how they combine this information to guide and modify their behavior over time in closed loop. And we've been testing this in an operant visual learning paradigm, again for fruit flies, and trying to link these types of computations to the underlying neural circuitry in the fly's brain. And since I know it's impossible to decipher what we're actually doing from the picture that I'm showing you here, if you're interested to hear more about this work, we just put it up here. Okay, so this just touches on a few of the things that we've been thinking about today, or in the past. I'd be happy to discuss these in any more detail offline. But today I want to tell you about work that we've been doing together with Victor Mlynarski, who's a fellow at IST Austria, to think about how the brain builds efficient representations of the sensory world that it can use to support different downstream computations like inference and prediction. And we've been thinking about these problems in the context of changing environments. So how should we think about efficiency when our surroundings are changing in time? Now, the study of efficient sensory representations is by no means new. It has a long history dating back to work by Batniab and Horace Barlow in the 1950s and 60s, and has been studied largely within the framework of the efficient coding hypothesis. And efficient coding posits that sensory systems should be efficiently tuned to the statistics of their input. And an early experimental test of the efficient coding hypothesis from work by Simon Laughlin in the early 80s, where he showed that neurons in the early visual system of the blowfly make efficient use of their limited response states or limited dynamic range in order to maximize the information they convey about a distribution of here incoming light intensity. And specifically, he showed how we could view the tuning properties of these neurons as performing histogram equalization, whereby they partition this distribution into equal probability chunks and assign these chunks to different response states of the neuron. So in this way, the output of this neuron maximizes the information that it conveys about this particular distribution of input. So again, this was an early test of efficient coding, and a corollary of this is that if this distribution were to change over time, then we would expect that the tuning properties of these neurons would also change. And so in this way, efficient coding has given us a normative framework for thinking about sensory adaptation. So how the response properties of sensory neurons should change in response to changes in them. And so I want to take this idea a little bit further, and I want to consider a specific model scenario for a moment, where we have a linear nonlinear neuron that encodes incoming patches of a natural image via linear filter and transforms the output of that linear filter into Poisson spike counts via this adapting nonlinearity. Now, in any naturalistic scenario, the image patches that this model neuron will encounter will vary in their statistical properties across different regions of a natural system. And so then we can ask whether and how this model neuron should adapt its encoding nonlinearity in order to reconstruct the output of this linear filter in these different, what we would call statistical contexts, different regions of a natural interval. And so we can, just for illustration, we can capture the variability in the filter outputs across an ensemble of natural scenes with a set of here 9 statistical contexts. It's just a choice we've made to illustrate this problem. Okay, so we're going to choose these statistical contexts to capture the variability that we observe across an ensemble of natural scenes. And these are just, we're describing these by different Gaussian distributions with different means and variances. And now we can design what I'm going to refer to as an oracle code that tunes this nonlinearity to each of these contexts individually in order to minimize decoding error. And we can compare this to what I'll call a global or static code that uses a single fixed nonlinearity that's matched to the marginal distribution across all 9 contexts. And now if we compare the performance of these 2 codes, we find that the oracle code outperforms the static code here by about 20%. And we're measuring this as a reduction in decoding error across these. Now, this is not surprising. I'm just telling you something that you already know, which is that it can be advantageous for a sensory system, or here a model neuron, to adapt its nonlinearity to the statistical distribution of its input. Now, the challenge with the way that I've set this up is that it assumes that the system has perfect knowledge of this underlying context, then it can tune its nonlinearity appropriately. But in real systems, this sort of statistical context has to be inferred from the same incoming stream of sensory stimuli that the system is trying, in this case, to decode. And so we can generalize this problem by using the output of this model neuron, not only to decode the filter output, but also to build and update an internal estimate of the underlying context. And then the system can use this estimate to adapt this filter, in this case, to minimize expected decay. And if we build a code like this, I'm going to refer to this as the naively adaptive code, we find that its performance is intermediate between the oracle code and the static code. Now, the reason that its performance is worse than the oracle code is that it's using an estimate of context to adapt rather than the true context. And that estimate can be wrong. So if we look at a situation where the context is changing over time, there will be times when the observer's estimate is correctly matched to the underlying context. And I'm going to mark these regions in white. And now there are times when the context estimate is incorrect and the system is mismatched. Yes?
Okay, it's puzzled by models of this. What they seem to imply is that there's some part of the brain that can peek past rightly without actually it's that. Is there an implicit separate pathway that does or something like that the brain?
Okay, so the question is, how does the brain know about the underlying context? So yes, everything that I'm going to tell you about today, we've made the assumption that the brain already knows the set of possible contexts that it could encounter, and it's just a question of which one I'm in right now. So there's a separate question of how to learn that contextual. And I think there's really nice work from Christina and from Eero thinking about how you could learn this type of statistical information in an online way and in a biologically plausible way, and that might underlie some of this. We're sort of building on top of that existing knowledge. But in principle, that's something that you'd have to learn alongside those same inputs in order to know how to choose amongst them. Does that answer the question? Or get partially there?
Okay.
Okay, all right. We have times in which the observer is correctly matched to the underlying context, and times in which it's incorrectly or mismatched to that context. And these periods of mismatch correspond to times here where the system is using the wrong nonlinearity for the underlying distribution of inputs. And now we can ask, how significant are these mismatches? How much are they contributing to the performance that we're measuring? And I'll remind you that this oracle code that we designed by construction is always perfectly matched to the underlying context. So all of its error occurs in these matched periods. But now if we decompose the error of this naively adaptive code, what we find is that a large fraction of the error of this code arises during these periods of mismatch. And so we are interested in understanding whether we could build an adaptive code in a better way. And we're going to be thinking about whether we can reduce the errors that are incurred during these periods of mismatch. Now, to start to get at this problem, we can recognize that both the Oracle code and the naively adaptive code use contextual information. The Oracle code has perfect context knowledge, the naively adaptive code has imperfect context knowledge, but in both cases, they use this knowledge to try to minimize this matched error. So assuming my estimate is correct, I'm going to try to do the best thing that I think I should do for the task at hand. And so what we're going to ask is whether we can build codes that use this context knowledge instead to minimize these errors that are incurred during periods of mismatch.
I want diagram.
We actually, so the first, for specific scenarios, so oftentimes we'll actually decode an estimate of the stimulus and use that estimate of the stimulus to update the context. So that would mean there's actually an arrow that comes back down from task, given that this is the way we've set up the task. But this is, in principle, we could consider other tasks that aren't decoding, and we might structure that differently. That's exactly what we'll be varying. So, and I'll be making that more specific. So depending on how we design this code, we will either be we're essentially going to be trying to design this feedback loop to bias towards prioritizing accurate reconstruction of the stimulus versus accurate inference of a change in context, and trying to dial between these. In both cases, we'll be using the observer's estimate of the incoming stimulus distribution to do that, to that optimization.
What is the problem of that?
Okay. So the question was whether we're using uncertainty in this feedback loop to help adapt the encoder. Uncertainty about the context. So here we're going to be assuming that we use a point estimate of that underlying context rather than the full posterior distribution. So this is sort of a compact summary of that rather than the full posterior to do the adaptation. For much of what I'm going to talk about today, we'll be talking about sort of a two-state scenario where there's not a difference between those. But as the number of contexts grows, keeping uncertainty about the ensemble of context would be an important point to include. Please. Great. Okay, so the question was, what precisely is the context in this particular setup? And so here we've made a simplification where we've taken linear filters, filtered an ensemble of natural images, and we've approximated the resulting distribution by a set of 9 different Gaussian distributions. That's just a choice that we made for illustration, where we're trying to capture that variability, and we've decided to divide it up into 9 contexts. So that's capturing the variability that we see in these filtered outputs. But in the more general point is that the context parameterizes the incoming distribution of stimuli. And so in different scenarios, we can consider different ways of doing that parameterization. That makes sense? Yes.
Possibly answer. So, an audience asks, does the downstream folder order?
Yes. Yes. So we assume that we also train the parameters of both the encoder and the decoder, given the system's current estimate of the context. So in that sense, the context is used to do the decoding before updating the context on the next Okay, great. I love the questions. Thank you. Keep asking. Okay, so our goal is going to be to try to design codes that use context knowledge, but that use it differently, to, instead of minimizing this matched error term, to try to minimize mismatched error. And the way that we're going to break this problem down is we're going to decompose the total error into these two contributions, contributions arising during periods of match or mismatch. And then we're going to design code that try to balance these two sources of errors in different ways. And we're going to parameterize that balance by a single parameter, a bias that sort of favors towards prioritizing one or the other of these two terms. And so at one end of the extreme, we have this naively adaptive code that we've been talking about that tries to minimize matched error given the current estimate. And at the other end of the extreme, we're going to be constructing what I'll call fully biased codes that are trying to minimize this mismatched error term. Now, this mismatched error can be high for two different reasons. It can be high because the instantaneous error rate is large, or because the duration of mismatches is long. And so in practice, we're going to bias towards reducing one or the other of these two sources of error, but we're not guaranteed to reduce both simultaneously. Okay, so to show you sort of give you a sense of what implications this will have, if we revisit the set of 9 contexts that we have here, and we consider a case where the observer's best estimate is that the environment is in context 1, then we could design a nonlinearity based on this context estimate in this naively adapted case that's trying to minimize matched error. And that would mean that we're trying to minimize errors given that that context estimate is correct. And this would just reduce to the same oracle nonlinearity that I showed you on the past slides. Alternatively, we could try to reduce this error rate. And that would be that we'd be trying to minimize errors if that context estimate is incorrect. And finally, we could try to reduce the duration of mismatches by trying to design a nonlinearity that best discriminates between contexts and can quickly allow the system to adapt. And the point I want you to take away here is that these 3 nonlinearities are different from one another. And these are all different given the same underlying estimate of the current context. And this will be true for all 9 of these contexts. And so that means that these different nonlinearities will prioritize different features of the input through this encoding that will propagate to the task of reconstructing inputs and updating this context estimate, and that will affect the adaptation through this closed loop. And so we're going to be trying to understand how this process unfolds dynamically when we put these nonlinearities back into an adapting system. Okay, and our goal again is going to be to try to construct what I would call an optimally adaptive code that can outperform this naively adaptive code by reducing this, mismatched error. Okay, so everything I've set up for you now has been set up with this sort of specific linear nonlinear model neuron, but the problem that we're trying to tackle is a more general one and has these basic components. So we're trying to understand how we should design a resource-constrained encoder to prioritize different features of an input. And that input can be changing over time, and the output of this encoder is then used to perform a task at hand. And we're going to show that the system can benefit by constructing this internal estimate of the underlying context that can be used to adapt the encoder. And once again, we're going to be trying to think about how this encoder should prioritize different sources of errors in order to dynamically balance these downstream objectives. So on the one hand, performing the tasks that you care about, and on the other hand, keeping track of the distribution of inputs that subserve that task. Okay. So to give us all an intuition about what we should expect to find as we try to construct these codes, I'm just going to sort of dig into this error decomposition a little bit more. So I mentioned that we're going to be trying to design codes that minimize this mismatched error, which has 2 contributions, the duration and error rate. And as we bias codes, we're always going to be comparing to this naively adaptive case. And so we can mark that naively adapted case as a point on this plane. And this dashed line here separates out regions of the plane where codes have higher or lower mismatched error compared to the naively adaptive case. And now we're going to try to bias the codes by either reducing the error rate or the duration of mismatches. But again, we're not guaranteed to reduce both simultaneously. And so that means, for example, if we try to reduce the error rate, we're going to be trying to find codes that live in this half of the space. But we could find that as we reduce that error rate, we actually increase the duration mismatches. And that could lead to even higher mismatched errors in the end. The same is true if we try to reduce the duration of mismatches. So here, we try to find codes that live in this part of the space. But as we decrease the duration of mismatches, we might find that we induce a very high instantaneous error rate that could lead to even higher mismatches. So we'll be looking to find codes that live in this lower left-hand corner. Now, if we find those, we're still not guaranteed that we will reduce the total error of the system overall. And that's because as we reduce mismatched error, we can pay a cost. We're going to necessarily increase the matched error. So that could lead to overall increases in total. So once again, we can place our naively adapted code in this plane. This partitions regions of higher or lower total error. And we'll be looking to see that if we reduce this mismatched error, can we find codes that, again, live in this lower left-hand portion of the code? And in this case, we'd be looking to find the optimal code that achieves the lowest. This is just a re-representation of the picture that I showed you earlier, where we're trying to find this optimally adapted code. Okay, I think that's the most times I'll use the word error in a couple-minute field. So if there are any questions about this now, this would be a great time to ask. If not, I will keep going and you should just interrupt me. Yes. So the matched error is the error that arises when the observer's estimate is correctly matched to the underlying context. The mismatched error arises during periods when that estimate is incorrect, mismatched.
You can always tell what kind of.
We can, if we define a criterion on how close the observer's estimate of the context has to be to consider it matched. So if it's a continuous estimate, it has to be sufficiently close to consider it matched. That is a choice that we make in sort of decomposing it into. They were wondering the ratio. Yes, absolutely. So the ratio, the relative time that the system spends matched or mismatched will depend on the underlying hazard rate. So how quickly these contexts are changing. And that becomes an important factor. I'll touch on that a little bit. Okay, great. So I'm going to tell you the punchline, and then I'm going to spend the rest of the talk unpacking that punchline. So we've studied this balance of errors in several different systems, including the linear nonlinear Poisson neuron that I used to motivate this, a simpler sigmoidal neuron that tracks changes in mean and variance of an incoming signal, and in more complex scenarios where we're trying to design adaptive populations of receptive fields. And in all of these different model systems, we find that biasing away from what's locally optimal can improve global performance when the environment is changing over time. And we see that in all three of these plots up above here. So you can see that the naively adapted code is in the upper left-hand corner. And as we bias away, we actually decrease the total error, and the optimal code is somewhere in between this naively adapted code and the fully biased one. And now to understand how and why we see this, I'm going to sort of unpack one of these, actually this middle scenario here. So we're going to take a deeper dive and look at this case where we have a sigmoidal neuron that's adapting to changes in mean and variance. And we're going to use this to understand why biasing away from what's locally optimal actually improves overall performance. We're going to use a setup that's very similar to the one that I sketched out at the beginning. But here, rather than having 9 contexts, we're just going to have 2. So the environment can switch between a low and a high state over time. And this context is going to parameterize either the variance or the mean of a Gaussian stimulus distribution. Now, at any point in time, stimulus from this distribution will be encoded through this adaptive encoder and will be mapped onto a discrete response level. Now that response level will be used to decode for the task of decoding here, so to decode an estimate of the stimulus and to update an estimate of the underlying context. And now when we design codes to design a naively adaptive code, you should think of that as prioritizing the task at hand. This is going to be a code that's designed to reconstruct the stimulus. And at the other end of the spectrum, we're going to design a code that's biased towards inference that will prioritize trying to maintain an accurate estimate. And then we're going to explore a family of codes in between. And so looking under the hood here, again, we have a context that can change over time between this low and high value. It parameterizes a Gaussian distribution of stimuli. These stimuli are encoded through this sigmoidal neuron with two free parameters here, the slope and the offset of this nonlinearity. And then this response is going to be used to reconstruct an estimate of the stimulus and update an estimate. And now when I say that we're going to design this naively adaptive code, what I mean by that is that we're going to choose the parameters of the encoder, here the slope and the offset, in order to minimize the error in reconstruction, given the system's current estimate of the incoming stimulus distribution. And on the other end of the spectrum, we design a fully biased code. We're going to try to minimize the error in this context estimate. Again, given this expected distribution of incoming. So I'm going to start by giving you some intuition about how these two different codes behave, and then we'll look at the spectrum that interpolates between. Okay, so we're going to compare these two different systems designed for accurate decoding and accurate inference, and we're going to look at how they both adapt when we have a context that's changing from high to low over time. And I'm going to, for this example, I'm going to show you the case where this parameterizes the mean of a Gaussian distribution. The mean of this distribution will be shifting over time. And then we're going to look at how these nonlinearities adapt to. So as I play this forward, you'll see that the nonlinearity on the right adapts much more quickly than the nonlinearity on the left, but it does so in a qualitatively different way. I think Eero coined this the inchworm. So you can see that there's sort of a sharpening and an expansion, a sharpening and an expansion, whereas the system on the right uses a nonlinearity with a fixed slope, which just scoots left and right. Now I'm going to show you this video one more time, but now we're going to track the performance. So how well these two systems do in the task at hand, which is the decoding task. And so we're going to measure the instantaneous decoding error. And this inset is going to just show a zoom in of this. Okay, so if we look right after a switch, we see a huge spike in decoding error from the system on the left. So even though it's designed for accurate decoding, if its estimate is incorrect, it incurs these very, very large errors. But once that context estimate equilibrates, you can see that the steady state error that it achieves is lower than the system. You'll see that. Okay, so these two different, what happens just after a switch versus what happens when the context estimate stabilizes, these are exactly these terms that we were describing earlier. These describe errors that are incurred during periods of match or mismatch. So this inset here is describing the matched error. So how well the system is doing when the context estimate is stabilized. Whereas this main panel is telling us about mismatched error. What are the errors right after a context switch when the system's estimate is incorrect? And so we see that these two different codes balance these terms in very different ways. So the purple code that's optimized for decoding has has low matched error but high mismatched error, and the reverse is true for the line for inference. And now if we bias between these, so we sort of interpolate between these two objectives, we sweep out a whole family of different codes that, again, balance these two terms in different ways. And we see this if the system is designed to track changes in the mean of the incoming stimulus distribution, and we see a similar pattern of behavior if the system is tracking changes. Now, to understand why this is the case, so to understand what's happening here, I'm actually going to go in and dissect why these nonlinearities are adapting in the way that they are. We're going to take a closer look at the nonlinearities that I showed you in that video. And you'll remember that these nonlinearities map a continuous stimulus onto a discrete set of response levels. And so what we're going to do is we're going to project these response levels back through the nonlinearity down onto the stimulus axis, and we're going to use this as a one-dimensional representation of the nonlinearity. And so the way that you should read this is that the closer these lines are together, the steeper the nonlinearity here. And if the nonlinearity shifts, so too will these lines. So now with this one-dimensional representation, we can look at a whole family of nonlinearities that sort of characterize the system's response to these things. And so I'm going to start with, again, the system that we looked at in the video that's designed for decoding. And now if the observer is certain that the environment is in the high context, it will align its nonlinearity right underneath this high distribution. And similarly, if the observer is certain of the low context, it will align this nonlinearity underneath the low distribution. And this is exactly what we would expect. This is very similar to what we sketched out in the very beginning with the Laughlin example. And now what we've done here is to specify what should happen in between these two extremes as a function of the observer's uncertainty about that context. And we parameterize that uncertainty by the observer's posterior belief that the environment is in the high state. And so what we find is that a system designed for accurate decoding just linearly interpolates between these two extremes. And this is exactly what we saw in the video. So we saw nonlinearity with a fixed slope that just shifted left and right. And that's exactly what we're looking at here. Just a shift in that offset, but the slope remains fixed. Now, if we look at the system designed for accurate inference, we find that already when the system is certain, the nonlinearities look different. You can see that they're broader, and these nonlinearities are devoting some of their resolution to the other distribution, to the change that might occur. And now if we look in between these two extremes, we see something qualitatively very different. So you can see here that when the system is uncertain, it actually uses a very sharp nonlinearity that's centered between these two distributions. And that allows the system to quickly detect whether stimuli are coming in from the low or the high mean distribution. And that was exactly this sort of sharpening that we saw in the video. So that happened at times when the system was uncertain about the underlying. So this is what we get when we look at these nonlinearities designed for a mean switching stimulus. And now I'll ask you all what you think we should expect if we were to generalize these ideas to a variance switching scenario. So I want you to think for a moment, if the things that I told you for a mean switching environment would generalize to variance, what would you expect to see in these plots? And then I'm going to ask you to just show me, and I probably can't do this very well in the virtual audience, but just show me with your arms what you think these lines should look like. I'm being totally serious. I see some of this, see some of this. Okay, I see none of the right answer yet. Yeah, these are, you got some good dance moves here. This is, so what we actually see this, so this was close. It's actually the flip of this, where we would expect to see a broad nonlinearity if the system is certain that the environment's in the high state, a narrow nonlinearity if the system thinks it's in a low variance state and just linearly interpolating in between. Now, don't worry, I will not ask you to generalize this picture with your arms, but if you could just take a moment and think about what you might expect to see. Oh, these are some great, okay. Please do use your arms if you would like to. I wish I had a video of the audience. Oh, excellent, okay, yes. This is what we see. So the first thing that you will notice is that this picture looks different depending on whether the observer is more certain that the environment's in the high state or the low state. So there's asymmetry. If the observer is more certain that the environment's in the high state, still somewhat uncertain, you can see that the nonlinearity here shifts to the tail of this distribution to discriminate those stimuli that would signal the high variance. If the system is more certain of the low variance distribution, but still uncertain, you can see that the nonlinearity becomes narrower and is centered to pick out stimuli that would discriminate. And now you might be some concerned looks, which is good. You might have a couple concerns that I'm going to try to alleviate. So you will have noticed also before that there are abrupt transitions in these nonlinearities. That's one thing you notice. And that there's sort of this asymmetry here, and that the nonlinearity shifts one way and not the other. Now, these abrupt transitions that we see here arise because the underlying error landscape that we're using to find these parameters can have multiple minima. So we find situations where one minimum takes over and becomes more advantageous compared to another. So just to show you what I mean here, if we zoom in these regions, so what you're looking at is the error in inference as a function of the slope and the offset of the nonlinearity. You can see that initially here there's one basin, and I've outlined that basin in white, and I've marked the minimum with this white dot. And you can see that that basin actually splits in two, and there are two degenerate minima, and these are equally good solutions. So we chose the solution that's shifted towards a lower offset because it produces a lower firing rate on average, but we could have alternatively chosen the other. So the important thing here is that the nonlinearity shifts to either of the tails of this distribution. And then you can see as we continue scanning down that these two basins converge again and form a single. And now if we, yes. So why it stands back out? So it's there's a very last, like as we're getting very close to the edge of this space with very high certainty. But this fan out here, this system is actually devoting some of its resolution to being able to detect what's coming in from that other distribution. So we think of this as sort of an uncertainty-dependent change detection, where within certain regions of uncertainty, the system is sort of aligning its nonlinearity to discriminate whether or not stimuli are coming in one or the other distributions, and it's choosing that strategy based on whether it's more certain, high or low variance. But then as you get to more certain regions, your estimate is very stable, and you're hedging some of your bets to a change that might. And that's why you actually get this broadening back out. Okay, just to show you what this lower set of landscapes looks like. Here we have a slightly different thing happening where there are two different minima, and one becomes more advantageous relative to. And you can see this, so here there's this semi-broad basin, and there are actually two different minima here, and at some point in uncertainty, you switch from the lower to the higher minimum being more advantageous. So we get an abrupt transition here, and again, this happening down below where there's a switch in which of these two minima more advantageous. Yes. Okay. So the question is, doesn't this depend on the sort of the smoothness of this error landscape, and how much whether you could sort of jump around between, if you raise the temperature of the system, could you jump around between these minima and actually smooth this out? So yes, this is something that we're exploring in more detail right now. So what are the structure of these landscapes? What are the degeneracies? If we think about imposing costs on actually adapting these parameters, which we haven't done now. Now we're allowing the system to choose whatever is optimal. But if you impose a cost on having to change these parameters, then that would restrict you to sort of move about in certain ways through the landscape. And that would depend on this underlying structure. So I think there's a really interesting set of questions here that we're just starting to dive into in terms of how we should think about this mapping onto biophysical parameters. Okay, excellent. So we can use this type of picture to understand here the sort of code designed for decoding versus inference, and a spectrum of codes in between. Here's an example of an intermediate code that shares features of the two extremes that I. And you can think about these plots as describing how the system is allocating resources to different stimuli in the environment as a function of its uncertainty about the underlying context. And now we can map this, we can take this picture and try to read out what we would expect the firing rate dynamics of neurons to be if they're adapting in these ways. And so those firing rate dynamics are going to depend on the observer's belief about the underlying context. So for illustration, I'm going to focus on this case where the observer believes the environment is in the low state. And so it's going to select its nonlinearity appropriately. And now we're just backing out from this picture we've taken a deep dive into. And again, this nonlinearity maps stimuli onto these discrete response levels. And we're going to assign spike counts to these response levels. And here I'm going to color the spike counts so that bright colors or white colors are high spike counts, dark purple is low. And so then we can apply this coloring to the picture up above. And now this tells us how the system is allocating spikes to different stimuli given the observer's estimate. Okay, and so now this is what the observer believes will happen. The firing rate that we would expect to measure will depend on how that belief relates to what's actually happening in the environment. And so we can now consider the case where the environment is indeed in the low state, so the observer's estimate is correctly matched. And now we can use this nonlinearity to partition this incoming distribution of stimuli and extract out a histogram of spike count. Now, if the environment abruptly switches from the low variance to the high variance state, so now the system is mismatched, you'll see that there's sort of a huge bulk of probability mass at the tails here. And so the histogram of spike counts changes following the switch. But if we just were to measure the average of this histogram, we would find that the average remains unchanged. And that we would expect, in this case, the firing rate not to change before versus after a switch. And of course, this is not at all what's observed experimentally. And what I'm going to show you is that with a simple parameter-free recoding of the output of this nonlinearity, we can actually recover firing rate dynamics that resemble those that are observed. And so the way that we're going to do that recoding is we're going to reassign these spike counts according to how likely the system, what the system expects, how frequently the system expects these response levels to be used. So we're going to assign the fewest spikes to the response levels that are expected to be used with the highest probability. So that means we're going to assign few spike counts here in the middle and high spike counts here on the edges. And this corresponds to a recoding of the output of this nonlinearity. We can apply this recoding as a coloring on this output, and we can apply that recoloring to this original. So we've just reallocated how the system is assigning spikes stimuli based on its expectation. And now we can walk through the exact same steps that I told you about earlier. So we can consider the case where the observer's estimate is correctly matched the underlying context. And now we have the same sort of histogram here, but the spike count assignment is different. And this leads to a lower firing rate. If we now look just after a switch, you can see that the bulk of this distribution is actually assigned to very high spike counts, and we see an abrupt increase in the firing rate. And now what happens from here depends on the sort of dynamic interaction between the observer's belief and this nonlinearity and the incoming distribution of stimuli. And so I'm going to show you a video of how this process unfolds in time. I'm going to show you this video twice because there are a lot of things going on here, but I'm just going to walk you through what you'll be seeing. So up in the upper right, we're going to be tracking these changes in context from low to high to low variance. And we're going to here be tracking the observer's belief about that underlying context. This belief is going to be used to select the appropriate nonlinearity at any point in time. That nonlinearity is going to determine how stimuli are encoded in spike counts, and we're going to measure the average of this histogram in this firing rate. Okay, so we see, again, just after an increase in variance, we see a spike in the firing rate followed by sort of a decay, and this decay follows the observer's belief about the underlying context. When there's a drop in variance, we see a drop in firing rate followed by a recovery. Again, that recovery is tracking the observer's continually updating estimate. Show you that one more time. Say that one more time.
So you're basically building a full wave rectification, which is going to convert variance. Is that
Yes, exactly. So you could approximate this as another nonlinearity that you put on the system to remap the yes, and the way in which we do it is strictly an entropy coding. So this gives us a way of now using this picture of sort of optimal allocation of resources to stimuli to translate that into a firing rate that we would expect to see as a function. And I've shown you this for one specific. Yes, do you have a question? Oh, I've just shown you this for one specific code here, but what I'm going to show you is now I'm going to generalize this to a spectrum of different codes. Now's a great time to ask. Yes, that's right.
That's it. Based on.
That's right. So the output of the encoder is being used to reconstruct the estimate of the stimulus and also update the estimate of the context. And then that context is fed back and it's used for the next time point. So it's sort of, strictly speaking, we use a prediction. So we say, this is my estimate at this point. This is what I predict for the next time point. I'm going to feed that prediction back and say, based on my prediction, I think you should use this nonlinearity. And then that's what's going to be used to determine the spike counts on the next pass through. Did that answer the question?
Yes. I'm just right.
Yes, exactly. That's right. So the actual encoding changes dynamically over time based on this feedback signal.
So,
that's right. So and I'm forgetting to repeat the question. So the last question was whether the decoder is also adapting over time, and that's something I haven't highlighted, but it's happening under the hood. So we are also adapting the decoding parameters to be able to accurately decode the stimulus given that context. Yes. That issue is really, at the end of the process, how you Okay, yes. So in practice here, we have this parameter-free recoding of the output. But then to reconstruct and decode, you would need to add an additional step so that you could separate. One way to do that would be to break it into on and off channels, so you treat the high and the low parts of the distribution. If you're only caring about variance, then you can afford to do this compression, so you can lose this information because you only care about the variance. But yes, this is you would need to add one additional step to be able to recover that information. Sure, about the biological plausibility of this. Yeah, so this could be approximated by a cascade of two nonlinearities rather than a single one. But it's true that in practice here, what we've done is sort of recoded the outputs on every time step given the observer's belief. So that's what we're formally doing in practice, but you could approximate this by another nonlinearity. And this is something that you could then plausibly link to more biophysical or mechanistic models of how this might be. Here we're sort of treating this in the normative sense of asking what would be optimal, and there's a second question of then how to map this right biophysical model.
So what if there was a bit-
Okay, great. I think we're sort of coming to, yes.
It's 1 p.m.
1 p.m. I should wrap up. Excellent. Okay, thank you. Okay, let me do that. So let me wrap up. It's a great point in time to do that. So I've been illustrating this to you for one specific code. But again, what we've done here is we have this whole spectrum of codes that balance different sources of errors in different ways. And so we can read off these firing rate dynamics for any code along this full spectrum. And I'm going to show you, I'm just going to pick out 2 specific codes, the one that's most accurate. This is the optimal code that we identified through this work. And we're going to compare it to the code that's fastest to adapt. And if we extract the firing rate dynamics of these 2 codes in response to changes in variance, we see that they produce qualitatively different responses following a decrease in variance. One shows a drop and then a recovery, and one shows an increase followed by a decay. And these qualitatively different response features have been observed in so-called adapting and sensitizing cells in the retina of salamander, mouse, rabbit, and primate. We can go one step further, and we can measure the time scale of this adaptation relative to the periodicity of the stimulus. And we see that as that periodicity increases, there's an increase in the time scale of adaptation. This is because the observer needs more and more samples to be convinced that the environment has switched states. And this sort of qualitative relationship has also been observed across a range of different systems, the blowfly to the mouse to the rat. And so stepping back out, what we've been trying to do with this work is design a general framework to understand how a resource-constrained system should dynamically balance task performance with the need to keep up with changes in the environment that subserve that task. We've used this to ask how a system should optimally allocate its resources as a function of its uncertainty about the environment, and have from this been able to provide a normative explanation for experimentally observed firing rate dynamics. And because this question came up already in part, so there are mechanistic models, biophysical models, to describe how a system could produce these types of dynamics. And what we've done with this work is to provide one candidate explanation as to why the system would want to produce these. And we would argue that that's because these reflect different objectives, different coding objectives. In one case, the system is trying to prioritize accurately reconstructing stimuli, and in the other case, because it's trying to infer changes in the underlying distribution of those stimuli. And so more generally, we've been trying to sort of expand efficient coding to non-stationary regimes. So moving beyond the original formulation and thinking about how to design a resource-constrained encoder for a stationary distribution, we've been trying to think about how the output of that encoder is used to support different downstream tasks, and what that implies about how we should design this encoder if the underlying distribution of inputs is have to perform these tasks in some changing environment. And to aid in that, it benefits a system to devote some resolution to maintaining and updating an internal estimate of that underlying content to best support this task. Now, everything I've told you about today has focused on imposing this resource constraint on the encoder itself. And one of the things that we've been thinking about in another line of work, and this is work that's really been led by another postdoc, Maz, in the lab, is how we should think of constraints imposed at the level of the observer that is helping to perform this particular task. And so one way to think about that in the context of what I've told you about today is that we were, for a large part, dealing with this environment that had these 2 states that were switching over time. And here, the observer needed to only maintain a posterior belief that the environment was in the high state at any time. But as we go to treat and understand more complex environments, this becomes really tricky and computationally intractable. And so Moz has been really interested in understanding how we should think about compression from the perspective of the observer, and how we could think about building abstract internal models that enable a system to perform sort of effective inference to be able to interact with. And so this is work that I hope to be able to tell you about. It's ongoing, so another time I'll tell you more. But with that, I will end. I want to thank the people that were involved in this work. So the bulk of what I told you about today was done jointly with Victor Monarski, a fellow at ISC Austria. I highlighted a bit at the beginning work from Ipe, Marcella, and at the very end from Moz. We've benefited from some great collaborations with Vivek Jayaraman's lab at Janelia and many other colleagues and collaborators there and elsewhere. I'd be happy to take questions. So thank you all. Yes. Great. Can you remind me your first question while I go to relay them?
I was wondering if by
Great. Okay. So the question was whether we could work backwards from experimentally observed dynamics to be able to infer the underlying computation. That's a great question, and something that yes, I think we can. So I mean, we have to here we postulate based on the particular system at hand and based on the types of inputs that it might be receiving, what types of computations might be reasonable for it to be performing. But then we can formulate this and work back and forth between the data and this approach to understand how the system might be balancing. And that's exactly what I think we're trying to do with this work, is provide a way of understanding, of moving beyond the stationary case to understand what are the normative computations underlying neural dynamics. The second question was about biological plausibility and how we work between this type of model and a more mechanistic one that can map this onto sort of biophysical parameters. And that's work that is still ongoing, something we're interested in trying to translate some of these computations to whether this is what stages of a pathway this is happening in, whether this is plasticity in amacrine cells and their synapses onto ganglion cells, how to think about mapping these computations onto those. But I don't have a concrete answer for you there. It's working. Yes.
You're allowed more than one line at timing. That general
Great. Okay. So the question was, how do we sort of think about this at a population level? And if you gave me now 2 nonlinearities instead of 1, would I solve this problem differently, or how do I generalize the problem? And that's a great question. So one of the things we've been thinking about is, so what I showed you here was a system, a single neuron that does either inference or reconstruction or balance of the two, but we're not sort of having both of those computations happen in parallel. And actually, in thinking back to mechanistic implementations, it might very well be some of the proposed models use sort of the feed-forward pathway to feed back onto a second pathway in order to adapt these sensitizing cells. So that might be what's actually happening in the system, that both of these are happening in parallel through different channels. But what you're asking about is how we sort of do resource allocation at a population level. And so there, we would expect that there are cases where you don't need to adapt. If you have enough resolution to be able to devote between, say, different contexts, maybe what you adapt to or the extent of that adaptation need not be as great. And so alternatively, you could multiplex different computations across that population if you give me more neurons to work with. So I think that's a really interesting space. I don't have answers to what that looks like beyond that. What you're asking about is how to do sort of a higher level allocation given multiple of these limited. So it's an interesting one and one that is still open. Yes. Yes. So the question was, how would the system behave if instead of having abrupt changes in parameters, we had slowly varying parameters? Here the dynamics will be constrained by how, in this case, how we build this observer model to track those changes. And so depending on the observer's belief about the timescale of those changes, that would sort of impact how we actually implement this process and think about adaptation. But yes, in practice, this is sort of highlighting in the most extreme case why how to do this dynamic reallocation. But any natural signal is going to be sort of a combination of multiple timescales of adaptation. And so one could think about sort of breaking this apart in the timescale domain. How do you tile or how do you devote resources across those different timescales? And that would be an interesting way to think about the population level coding question as well. So given multiple nonlinearities, could you think about this now in that timescale? Yes. Yes. Okay. So the question is now thinking across different organisms and different sizes of brains. How do we think these problems generalize or scale, or are they qualitatively different? So I do think what we're trying to frame here is quite general in the sense that if you're trying to perform a task and the environment is changing over time, you have to devote some resources to keeping track of the distribution of those signals that help you perform that task. So that I think is quite a general statement. But the specifics will matter. So exactly sort of what task is being performed, how strong the resource constraints are, what the nature of the inputs are, that will change the specifics of what the optimal scenario will be. But the idea that a system has to think about this balance and devote some of its resources in this sort of non-greedy way, anticipating other changes, I think that's the thing that generalizes. And we would expect to generalize across systems and across scale. But I think sort of mapping that space out and understanding how the details actually factor into these specific coding schemes.
So I don't recall that you spoke about a specific type of self in the brain that you haven't required that would happen retina or
Yes. Okay. So the question was, where might this be happening in the brain? What are the specific cells? So our closest link right now is to these adapting and sensitizing retinal ganglion cells. And these patterns of dynamics have been observed in many different animals. And so that is from the perspective of sort of commonality across systems, this is a nice place to make that connection point and to understand why it is that we see these same patterns of dynamics happening across these different organisms. But I don't think this is just a retina problem, meaning I think that this question of how you do dynamic resource allocation generalizes to other brain regions as well. I think there the challenge becomes, what are the inputs? What are the downstream outputs, the task at hand, and what other feedback or recurrence is there that's enriching the picture? And so I think there we haven't made connection yet to specific experimental data, but that's not because I think that problem is not needing to be solved, but rather that there's still work to be done in making that. Does that answer your question? Thank you for that.